Tell us about the impact that the scope of the attack had on Al-Qaeda. They must have known immediately that if it was their wish that the Americans would come after them into Afghanistan, that they would get that wish.
Paradoxically, it was a disaster for Al-Qaeda, and within the organization, this was highly controversial. Many people in Al-Qaeda, probably most, didn't know of the existence of the plan. There were rumors, and if you read, what was going on inside Al-Qaeda in their internal memoranda and so on, you'll find that there were a lot of dreams going on. That there was a kind of a dream cult inside Al-Qaeda where they report their dreams every day, and Bin Laden would decipher them. And after a while, I said, no more dreams and no more talk of flying. He said that he was afraid that this would sort of leak through the consciousness of other members of Al-Qaeda who weren't supposed to know about this plot. It's when 9/11 actually happened, there were a lot of members that were just appalled. They couldn't believe that Al-Qaeda had done it, and then they were very worried about what was going to happen. And indeed, of course, within 6 weeks, Al-Qaeda was on the run, being pummeled, scattered. If you read their internal documents, 80% of Al-Qaeda's leadership and membership was captured or killed in November, December 2001. Yeah, the leaders did get away, but they were scattered, they were destitute, they were unable to communicate with each other, and they were repudiated all over the world. Al-Qaeda was really dead. The war on terror was actually pretty much over after the end of 2001.
How do you explain the successful escape of Bin Laden, Zawahiri, the ultimate senior leadership of Al-Qaeda in the war from Afghanistan? They have seemed since then to have found safe haven in Pakistan along the border. That implies at least some knowledge by some within Pakistan about their whereabouts. Was it bad planning, bad luck, a combination of all kinds of circumstances that allowed them simply to slip away? What happened that allowed them to get away?
I don't think luck had very much to do with it. We were counting on the Pakistanis to close the back door, which we should have closed ourselves. There were, American fleets nearby, many troops that could have been brought in. There were only 410 members of the special forces who were actually on the ground in Afghanistan during that time. It was, Northern Alliance, Afghan Army, immense amount of American firepower, but really on the ground, very few Americans. And there was a general reluctance to bring in real American troops to put them on the ground and actually face Al-Qaeda, because that's what Al-Qaeda wanted, and at the time we wanted this to be seen as an Afghan victory, and the Muslims were taking care of the problem themselves. Well, the very porous border, very mountainous, the passes weren't guarded, and the leaders simply went through.
I want to skip ahead and think about Al-Qaeda today. We read about its presence, as I said, somewhere in that border area, very porous border area between Afghanistan and the northern territories of Pakistan, the Northwest Frontier Province. We don't know exactly what they're up to, but certainly a resurgence of fighting in Afghanistan indicates something about their presence. How do you see them today, and what capacity do you think they have still?
Well, Al-Qaeda is, if you think of Al-Qaeda proper, the Bin Laden Zawahiri machine that is the core of Al-Qaeda, it's much reduced. The Egyptian intelligence told me they count maybe 200 or fewer members of that central organization. The CIA thinks 300 to 500, but either way, it's much fewer than the thousands that were there beforehand, before 9/11. But still, it's in a fairly secure place. It's a place where training is still being done, as we've seen. The number of operations in Europe where there have been members of Al-Qaeda who've gone back and forth to the Pakistani training camps in the tribal areas. So Al-Qaeda is smaller, it's reconstituting, it's fairly safe, and that makes it very dangerous. Now there's a larger entity of Al-Qaeda, which is composed of the affiliates. There are formal affiliates. Remember when Zarqawi, who was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, he had made application to join Al-Qaeda, he and his organization. And it took about a year for bin Laden to say yes to that. But that became Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in the land of the two rivers. Then there's Al-Qaeda in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. These are all formal affiliates. Then there's sort of shadow things like Al-Qaeda in Egypt, which doesn't really exist except in name. Beyond that, you have wannabes, sympathizers. And that movement, unfortunately, is really big.
In June 2008, you wrote in The New Yorker about an important moment in the sort of intellectual life of this Islamic underworld, in which this figure who's known as Dr. Fadl, an Egyptian physician, who was a schoolmate, I believe, of Zawahiri back in medical school days,
Right.
who was an original theorist of Al-Qaeda, has since recanted and has since written a book that basically challenges all of the precepts of violence, of takfir that we spoke about earlier, all of these things that underpin Al-Qaeda's ideology, which Dr. Fadl himself had been one of the originators of.
Right.
He has now recanted completely.
He's the guy that wrote the books that Al-Qaeda gave to the recruits, the ones that they indoctrinated them on the violent philosophy that Al-Qaeda embraces. And he's the one that told these young recruits that jihad is mandatory for all Muslims, and that Muslims must always be in conflict with non-believers, and that the leaders of Arab countries are all infidels and must be killed. And not only them, everybody who works in the government, everyone who's in the police or the courts, everyone who votes in a democratic election, they must all be killed. All of that is, at the foundation of Al-Qaeda's philosophy. And then, right after 2001, after 9/11, he's picked up in Yemen and sent to prison in Egypt. And okay, prison in Egypt, one might write anything. But this is a very closely reasoned book. And that's the reason Zawahiri takes it so seriously. He takes it seriously enough, he's written an entire book in response. And you can see that he's very much on the defensive, because Dr. Fadl is the one that they used, the one that they turned to as a religious authority. Now, it's a debate within radical Islam, and who knows how the debate will come out. But if you are a young radical Muslim and you're considering the prospect, for instance, of martyrdom, and you don't want a debate, you want certainty. You want to know that the surrender of your life is going to bring you glory, paradise, all the things they promise. And suddenly there's a debate over these issues. That in itself is a crippling state of affairs for Al-Qaeda.
Thank you. My guest today has been Lawrence Wright, author of the Pulitzer Prize winning The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11. I'm Clifford Chanin for the National September 11th Memorial and Museum.
Thanks, Cliff.
Thank you very much.